starting a little bit higher in 98, but also staying flat on most things probably a little bit longer, so that you're seeing less difference from 25 to say 60, 67 even in a lot of these things. And then here it's about 25 to maybe 53, 60. Yeah.
So was the test improved or changed between the 2 years?
Should be the same test. And they have in some of their studies they talk about practice effects. Although these are, I think the Seattle studies like 7-year gaps. Longitudinal change, a different kind of picture with people sort of mostly either staying flat or on some things like verbal meaning, of course, have been going up from 25 to about 53 or 60. What's this one doing? Inductive reasoning? I don't expect that so much. And then kind of going down thereafter. Now, one of the ways that historically I think is kind of interesting, in the 70s, Moyer was very much fighting the whole idea that there was decline of intelligence and age, and seeing that as kind of an inaccurate social stereotype. The Seattle study only had data out to about here, 67, 74. And two things have happened since, like, say, the 80s till now. One is that we now have data out to like almost 90 years of age. And the other is that he shifted analytic techniques from the analysis of variance kinds of stuff to like structural equation modeling and some of the other more modern longitudinal analyses. And one of the things that those more modern analyses do is that they, rather than focusing on estimates of means at each of these points, you're actually calculating slopes over the whole age range. And so in some cases, the change in analysis kind of backed up where a downward slope started. So like the mean differences didn't look like that much from here to here. You were able to show that actually the downward slope started a decade or two. So far, just looking at these, like the shift from these longitudinal estimates for the 5 mental abilities, the shift has gone in thinking from you peak at early adulthood and you're downhill all the way from there on out to a pretty wide consensus, not just the Seattle studies, but across a lot of other studies as well, that you have in many of the abilities that you've got stability and in a few even increases from young adulthood up to sometime in middle age, and then somewhere, and people vary quite a bit on where they draw the line, but somewhere between 55 and 70, you've got on average at least a decline that goes on into the older years.
Do they look at the different ranges at each age, like individual differences? Like maybe there are higher standard deviations at older ages? Like there's people who decline a lot than some people who stay the
same. They do. And after the break, I'll pull up what those kind of plots look like. If you look at the Zielinski and Kennison paper, they show you individual plots, which people in the field finally refer to as spaghetti.
Oh yeah, those.
Ones where they're just lines going everywhere, they're all crossing each other and stuff. And we'll look at some kind of reduced estimates of that probably after the break as well. But one of the things that Shai has called attention to is that although you get these average patterns of change, it's actually not the case that everybody is changing in the same way over time, or in the same directions over time. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's a great point that you get these individual variations. Actual cohort data. So in this case, you're looking at birth year cohorts rather than ages. And you just get various kinds of patterns here. Verbal meaning sort of mostly went up from the 1889 cohort to about 1952, and then it's kind of dropped a little bit and leveled out. One of the things I think I kind of focus on in this is, although a lot of successive cohort changes favor later born cohorts, not all of them do. Word fluencies had this kind of odd little dip around the 1930s, and then it's sort of been increasing since then. Numerical ability kind of goes up, wobbles around a little bit, comes down, and then there's maybe a little bit of an upturn here in the late 60s birth cohorts.
What does word fluency mean, though? It just means your ability to articulate quickly, rapidly, normally?
Yeah, something like that.
And then also I had a question about
Your ease of access to semantic memory or your vocabulary, oddly defined. Sometimes done like you saw the example here with the letter S. Sometimes it's like how many animals can you name? Subject and semantic.
and then the black line when we were reading, that's like the combination of everything, right?
Yeah, that's everything. And then you get the ones that have been the most systematic in most graphs is spatial orientation is basically gone up, and inductive reasoning has basically increased. This is called the Flynn effect, because there's this Australian economist actually who's interested in intelligence at the national level and whether average national intelligence correlated with like gross national product and stuff, and whether changes in that over time predicted changes in economic output. Not unlike Eileen Crimmins' husband, Dick Easterland, who's an economist, looks at things like national life satisfaction, whether that varies in gross national product. So, interesting sort of issues. And Flynn has compiled a lot of data on this, looking basically at adolescents and young adults, and it's shown that IQ, and especially these two kinds of IQ, spatial orientation and inductive reasoning, have increased just about everywhere it's been measured across the 20th century in successive cohorts. So I think got a major effect going on, not just in Seattle, in case you were wondering. more globally around the world. So, not always immediately obvious, but he was here a few years ago, and he actually, in his lectures, he argues that it's the shift from, people would argue back about this, I'm sure, the shift from sort of rote learning in the early 20th century to more conceptually based educational practices later on in the 20th century. I think you have a hard time arguing that that was a continuous process. Lots of people are inclined to counter-argue that years of education don't mean the same thing in different countries. It's a fairly common assertion that a high school degree before World War II might be roughly equivalent to a college degree after World War II in terms of how white people are and what they know and what they're able to do. So, this is kind of, as you probably realize already, I find cohort effects kind of fascinating. I think they're an interesting counterpoint and counter-explanation to a lot of developmental aging effects. One of the real difficulties about them is explaining them, because we mostly just don't have the data and the information that we need, so we rely on things like maybe it's educational levels, although at the same time, people think that there's been a lot of inflation in educational levels. So what we to make of that. We talked some, I think, in previous, this last week, we talked some about like